June 1944. The world holds its breath. Over 1 million soldiers, thousands of ships, and planes storm Nazi-occupied France. Secrets, spies, and courage collide as history hangs in the balance. This is D-Day, the invasion that changed everything. June 6, 1944. A gray morning rises over the Channel, showing a breathtaking scene. Never before had the world seen such a huge fleet. On 7,000 ships, 130,000 soldiers crossed the sea, protected by 20,000 planes. At sunrise, after heavy gunfire, the men landed on the coast of France. Another 20,000 arrived by air. That day, 10,500 Allied soldiers were killed, along with nearly the same number of Germans. 11 weeks later, Paris was free, and the path to Berlin lay open. This film will tell the story from both sides, Allies and Germans, from its planning in Britain in January 1944 to its final outcome in summer. It features the leaders, U.S. Generals Dwight Eisenhower and Omar Bradley, British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, and the countless unknown heroes who fought in the landings. Also men like Sergeant Grant, who risked everything to film these events. They all took part in this massive event, which, unlike the legend, was no simple victory. March December 1, 1943, at the Tehran Conference, 3 world leaders made a crucial decision. At the top of the steps stood Joseph Stalin, the confident leader of the Soviet Union. Lower down was Winston Churchill, the worried-looking British Prime Minister. For 2 years, Stalin, Churchill, and U.S. President Roosevelt had argued over when to begin the invasion of Western Europe. The outcome of the war, and the world, depended on it. Since June 1941, when Germany attacked the Soviet Union, Stalin had demanded a second front in the West to ease the pressure on his own troops fighting Hitler in the East. Churchill, however, feared a direct assault on Germany. Instead, with U.S. support, the Allies tried to weaken the Axis by fighting through North Africa, and then invading southern Europe. They all took part in this massive event. Their progress stalled, unlike the legend, could not advance was no simple victory march. For a long time, Roosevelt hesitated. He felt America was not yet ready for such a huge operation. But now, determined to end Hitler's rule quickly, he agreed to strike in the West. He also hoped for future cooperation with the Soviets once the war was over. Churchill had no choice but to accept. Since America's entry into the war in 1941, Hitler himself had feared just such an invasion of the German-occupied western coast of Europe. In 1942, Hitler began planning a huge project, the Atlantic Wall, a chain of defenses stretching nearly 4,000 miles. From northern Norway down to the Spanish border. Most Germans believed the Allies would attack near Calais, only 25 miles across the Channel from Britain. The Germans forced thousands of men into labor, free workers, Frenchmen drafted into compulsory service, refugees, Jews, and prisoners of war. The project needed 13 million tons of concrete. By the end of 1943, Fortress Europe looked firmly in German hands. Then, on January 15, 1944, Roosevelt chose General Dwight Eisenhower to lead the invasion. Eisenhower arrived in London to plan Operation Overlord. Confident, he declared, "I believe soldiers, sailors, airmen, and all free nations will show that democracy is the strongest fighting force ever created." Soon after, Eisenhower presented his team to the press. Since he was American, his deputy had to be British. For this, the generals already had General Bernard Montgomery, but it had to remain secret. The hero of North Africa, the cameras, admired by his people, in front of a blurred, unreadable map. As usual, Monty enjoyed the spotlight, focusing on the cameras more than the discussion. In truth, the decision had already been made. The landings would be in France, not at Calais as expected, but in Normandy. Although the Normandy beaches were farther from Britain, they were less protected. The invasion was planned for spring, between Ouistreham and Carentan, at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula. Montgomery wanted to expand the front line toward Cannes, to avoid being trapped on a narrow beach area. He also wanted to push west toward Cherbourg, whose secrecy was key. The Germans had to remain completely unaware of the Allies' true plan. By early 1944, they still weren't sure where the landings would happen. This gave the Allies a chance to spread propaganda and mislead them. Hitler's fears of a Western invasion grew stronger when Eisenhower arrived in London. Back in 1942, he had appointed one of his most skilled generals, Erwin Rommel, as Field Marshal. Nicknamed the Desert Fox, Rommel had frustrated the British many times in North Africa. Now, Hitler trusted him to strengthen the defenses of Fortress Europe. By early 1944, Rommel was in France. But since the German Air Force was stuck at home defending against Allied bombing raids, he had no planes to use in Normandy. The coming battle would be fought on land and beaches. He pushed to fill the gaps between fortified towns and ordered more mines along the coast. But France's coastline stretched 750 miles, making it impossible to fully protect. Eisenhower wasn't worried. For months, the Allies had been secretly building floating harbors, so they wouldn't need to capture a real port immediately. This gave them freedom to choose where to attack. The Allies were ready for the enormous challenge ahead. Huge concrete blocks, called phalanxes, were built to be towed across the channel and sunk off Normandy to form breakwaters. Floating docks were also prepared, so ships could unload tons of supplies and thousands of soldiers onto steel pontoons, giving access to the beaches no matter the tide. It was like a giant construction training in Britain continued. British and American troops practiced every scenario, though sometimes it was just for the cameras. Soldiers trained in the water, used fireworks for mock battles, and tested new equipment. There were mine-clearing tanks to open safe paths, mats to cross sandy beaches, and jeeps tested on rough roads. The new Churchill crocodile tanks, armed with flamethrowers, were meant to destroy anything left standing after bombing. These exercises were dangerous. Hundreds of men died during training in Britain, but the Allies needed to prepare for every terrain and situation. Even the tough British Commando Brigade trained in the harsh landscapes of Cornwall. The American soldiers, coming from states like Utah, Kansas, Ohio, and Kentucky, more than 800,000 didn't even know exactly where Britain or France were on the map. Still arriving, nor could they imagine what awaited them on the beaches of Normandy. Like donuts served by British serfswomen, a taste of home before the storm to come. America also shipped over massive amounts of equipment, including tanks, designed to stand against Germany's powerful panzer divisions. In small gray towns across England, locals watched as new American P-38 bombers filled the skies, their range far greater than British planes. But the arrival of so many U.S. troops wasn't always easy. Families were sometimes forced to leave their homes to make space, children crying as soldiers moved in. The British saw themselves as struggling with little, while the rich Americans arrived with better food and supplies. Yet, friendships grew. In places like Blackpool, U.S. soldiers enjoyed rest and leisure, welcomed by local girls, often leaving behind broken marriages and many children born out of wartime affairs. Connections between Americans and British grew stronger, both on the battlefield and off. General Eisenhower also worked hard to keep respect between allies. In March, he visited Sandhurst Military Academy, the same school where Winston Churchill had once studied. Speaking to the young cadets, Ike reminded them of their duty. You must know your men, be their leader, their father, their guide. Strength alone is not enough. True leadership is caring for those you command. These young British officers, barely in their 20s, listened knowing many would soon give their lives for a nation that had resisted the Nazis for long years. That same month, Churchill himself attended a large training exercise of U.S. paratroopers, with Eisenhower at his side. British newsreels captured the action, even mounting cameras on board to show the scale of preparation for the invasion. If it weren't for Churchill's cigar, you might have thought the training exercise was the real invasion. Cameras were everywhere, and the footage was later reused by filmmakers to pretend it was the actual first U.S. paratrooper landings in Normandy, which were never filmed in real life. More importantly, Churchill was now fully supporting Operation Overlord, despite his earlier doubts. Meanwhile, Hitler was far away at his headquarters near the Soviet front. In the West, he split command between two leaders, Field Marshal von Rundstedt, in charge of the Western Front, and Field Marshal Rommel, in charge of coastal defenses. But they disagreed. Rundstedt wanted to keep tanks inland so they could move quickly once the Allies landed. Rommel argued that Allied planes would stop German forces from moving freely, so he wanted tanks right near the beaches to crush the invasion early. In England, American soldiers trained for beach assaults on rocky coasts, very similar to the future landing site of Omaha Beach. They practiced digging in, setting up radios, helping the wounded, and holding their ground. Still, nothing could fully prepare them for the reality. On Omaha Beach alone, 3,000 Americans would die. The Allies, however, knew the German defenses well. With the help of the French resistance, who risked their lives under brutal Nazi crackdowns, they gathered thousands of photos and detailed maps of the coast. Every bunker, obstacle, and trench was marked in the plan. But intelligence worked both ways. The Allies also fed the Germans with false information. For months, they made Hitler believe the invasion would happen at Calais. They even built fake airfields and set up fields of inflatable planes to keep the enemy focused in the wrong place. Soldiers were given a new French currency, printed by the Allies. General Charles de Gaulle was furious. He felt only France had the right to issue its own money. But for now, he was kept out of the planning. Another cameraman, Sergeant Ian Grant, always wearing his Scottish beret, had joined the film corps to avoid chores and to document his comrades. On May the 31st, he filmed soldiers receiving booklets about the land they were about to invade. It was in that camp that we first found out our target was Normandy, he later recalled. He also filmed the men receiving extra rations as they prepared for what lay ahead. On June the 1st, Norman Clogg filmed his unit's final instructions. He shot from above. By early June, the waiting was over. The Americans had brought 1.5 million men to Britain, more than even the British themselves had in the South. Hundreds of thousands now left their camps, cheered on by locals as they marched to 19 different embarkation ports along the coast. The Canadians, known for their deep Christian faith, filled the chapels on June the 4th. Never before had church services been so crowded. Everyone prayed for strength to face what was coming. We just sat there on board with nothing to do but eat and smoke. We had plenty of food. I had 10 men's rations just for myself. A mood of bitter disappointment came over us. We still didn't know where we were going, only that we were crossing the channel. Later, they told us it was Lyon-sur-Mer, but that meant nothing to us. At the ports, frustration grew. Landing craft circled endlessly in the water like restless crocodiles. On June the 4th, cameraman Desmond O'Neill was with British troops of the 3rd Division. The strong wind showed no sign of calming. Later, he recalled, day and night, General Eisenhower and his team stayed in touch with the weather office. The reports were grim. Bad weather was expected for the next 2 weeks. That would be a disaster. Not only would the soldiers lose motivation, but the whole campaign would be delayed. A half-tide at dawn, so landing craft could reach the beaches. In June, only 3 days fit those conditions, the 5th, 6th, or 7th. I picked June the 5th, but as the day approached, the weather turned. On June the 4th, with ships already sailing, a violent storm swept the channel. Eisenhower had no choice but to call them back. Operation Overlord itself was now in danger. The delay risked exposing the plan, and the Germans might already be watching. Over 20,000 vehicles were carefully loaded backward into the holds of ships, so they could drive straight out onto the beaches. Alongside them went thousands of tons of food, ammunition, and supplies, everything needed to support the invasion. General Eisenhower had chosen the timing carefully. The landings needed a full moon at night for visibility. British troops boarded ships in the east. American GIs boarded in the west. The Canadians, the third largest Allied force, sent 21,000 men. The Americans, on the other hand, tried to stay busy. They knew idleness was the enemy. Waiting too long could exhaust morale before the battle even began. Then, on the evening of June the 4th, a small glimmer of hope appeared. The forecast now suggested the seas might calm by June the 5th and 6th. That night, in just 30 minutes, Eisenhower made the decision that would change history. The invasion would go ahead on June the 6th, 1944. On June the 5th, the great machine of war roared into action. Allied planes struck northern and western France to stop German reinforcements from reaching Normandy. For 3 days, waves of bombers pounded lower Normandy. Around 4,000 people, both German troops and French civilians, were killed. This caused fierce debate. Churchill feared the bombings would make the French hate the Allies. But to his surprise, the French resistance replied firmly, "This is war. We must accept that people will die." Meanwhile, on June the 3rd in Algiers, General Charles de Gaulle had transformed the French Committee of National Liberation into the Provisional Government of the French Republic. Yet even now, the Allies still kept him in the dark. Their plans for D-Day were not shared with him. As the liberation of France drew closer, the British and Americans needed Charles de Gaulle to help unite the French people in resistance. On June the 4th, after Churchill summoned him, de Gaulle traveled to Britain, determined to make his voice heard. He refused to simply let the Allies dictate terms. Yet, even though they denied him full authority, the proud general agreed to support Operation Overlord. On June the 5th at sea, the Allies continued their deception plans. Dozens of small ships sailed north of Le Havre, releasing huge clouds of smoke to make the Germans believe that a massive fleet was heading far north of the real landing beaches. Nearby, reconnaissance paratroopers had no commander to encourage them, so they created their own rituals. Some painted their faces red like Native American warriors, others rubbed charcoal on their cheeks to stay hidden in the dark. Along with their parachutes and rifles, they carried radio transmitters, which they would use to mark safe drop zones for incoming gliders. Each paratrooper needed 3 men to help him gear up. Everyone knew the grim odds. Their chance of surviving the night was only about 50%. That same night, Eisenhower quietly wrote a note in case the invasion failed. In it, he took full responsibility. My decision to attack at this time and place was based on the best information available. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. But the Allies had spent months perfecting their plan. On the night of June the 5th, bombers were ordered to strike German coastal defenses. At dawn, naval guns would begin firing from 45 miles offshore. The invasion would come in 2 parts. On the right flank, the British and Canadians would land on 3 beaches, Sword, Juno, and Gold, stretching between Moustrum and Arromanches. Their mission was to capture Cannes, a key road and rail hub that would allow tanks and planes to spread into open ground. On the left flank, the Americans would storm Utah and Omaha beaches. From there, they would push toward Cherbourg, planning to capture the vital port within a week. This would allow hundreds of thousands of men and tons of supplies to pour into France for the next phase of the war. On June 6, 1944, at 3:15 in the morning, Allied planes began bombing German positions along the invasion zone. As the sun rose, the massive guns of the Allied fleet opened fire, pounding the Atlantic Wall. The first objective was Omaha Beach, near the Cotentin Peninsula. The American troops had to secure a beachhead, then link up with their comrades landing at Utah Beach, before pushing toward Cherbourg. But things went wrong from the start. Many of the bombers missed their targets, and the naval guns failed to destroy most of the German defenses. That left the job to the men on the ground, especially the battle-hardened soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One. With them was the 116th Regiment, made up of young soldiers, who had never faced combat before. The landing craft released the men to far from shore, into rough seas. Packed tightly inside, seasick and terrified, they pressed forward. The war photographer Robert Capa, who was there, recalled, "When the first shells hit, we hit the deck and lay in our vomit, unable to watch the coast getting closer. When the ramps dropped, the Americans were met by nearly untouched German defenses. It was a massacre. Strong tides pushed later waves of troops straight into Rommel's obstacles, forcing them to wade through deep water under heavy fire. Many drowned, dragged under by their own heavy gear. The beach soon turned red with blood. Omaha would forever be remembered as Bloody Omaha. The U.S. command even considered calling off the attack. But if they did, the men already ashore would be abandoned, their sacrifice wasted. Worse, it would tear open the Allied front just as the invasion was beginning. He wrote later, This was the real thing. I filmed the massive fleet as best I could. We had good rations, even seasickness pills. But the diesel fumes made most of us sick. The sky was black with planes flying low. The men were silent, lost in their own thoughts. I wasn't afraid, because there was no fear on their faces, only the desire to get off that damned boat. As they neared the beach, ramps broke, and chaos followed. The men scrambled down, whatever gangplank they could, heavy packs dragging them into the sea. Unlike at Omaha, they were spared the worst of the first German assault. That day, Allied planes flew 10,000 missions, bombing not just the beaches, but also airfields, railways, bridges, and communication hubs, crippling German movement. At the same time, the French resistance launched sabotage attacks across the country, slowing down reinforcements from Brittany and southern France. Rommel, who had always argued that troops should be placed directly at the beaches, was now proven right, but it was too late. The British 3rd Infantry Division was landing at Sword Beach, tasked with capturing Ouistreham and advancing quickly toward Cannes. Among them was the 45th Royal Marine Commando, filmed by Sergeant Ian Grant. By daybreak, the scale of the operation became clear. An armada of 7,000 ships stretched across the channel. At 9:45 a.m., Eisenhower spoke to the world over the BBC. "I call upon all who love freedom to stand with us now. Keep faith. Together we shall achieve victory." Across a 45-mile front, there was almost one ship every 250 meters, shielded by 11,000 Allied aircraft. Each plane carried white stripes so friendly fire wouldn't mistake them. Not every beach was like Omaha. German commanders, fooled by Allied deception, still believed the main attack would come at Calais, so their reinforcements were slow to move. The so-called Atlantic Wall was starting to crumble. For the men on Sword Beach, the hardest part was only just beginning. They had to push inland and link up with the paratroopers, who had been dropped behind enemy lines. Another cameraman, Sergeant Desmond O'Neill, the youngest of the group, had arrived 45 minutes earlier than Sergeant Grant. He captured the last moments of the battle on Sword. In the thick gray smoke, everything felt unreal. This wasn't a battle you could imagine from a movie. The beach exits were jammed, almost impossible to get through. I followed a platoon trying to break out, but then O'Neill's camera jolted. He had been shot. He filmed only a few more seconds before being evacuated for medical care. Sword Beach was taken that day, but at the cost of 600 dead and wounded, most of them barely 20 years old. Captured German prisoners were rounded up on the sand. A few miles away, the Canadians were landing at Juno Beach, their goal, Ken's Carpiquet airfield. These young men had crossed 5,000 miles from Canada to reach a quiet seaside town in Normandy called Bernières-sur-Mer. The first wave of Canadians was caught on camera, the only landing filmed live that day, thanks to an automatic camera affixed to a landing craft. Even through the cold eye of the lens, a simple human moment was visible, the liberation of the first French house in Normandy. But it came at a terrible cost. 100 Canadians killed. Cameramen were told not to film alive dead. Instead, they were urged to show German prisoners and the anger of liberated French civilians. Still, Juno was far from easy. Rough seas battered the second wave of Canadians, making the landings even harder. By nightfall, 300 young Canadians had lost their lives, but their sacrifice secured a beachhead and opened the road inland toward Cannes. French villagers greeted the liberators with joy. Young women laughed and embraced soldiers. Many Canadians spoke French, though with a funny accent. Back in Portsmouth, Admiral Ramsay beamed with pride at his fleet's success, but General Eisenhower looked grim. Since morning, reports had poured in, some encouraging, like Utah and the British beaches, but others terrifying, especially from Omaha. Eisenhower's face showed the truth. The battle was far from over. On Omaha Beach, 6 hours after the first wave, U.S. troops were still pinned down at the cliffs. The Americans did everything they could for their men, bringing doctors in the first assault waves to care for the wounded, even the enemy. At Omaha, their work was endless. The beach was littered with dead soldiers, prisoners, and the wounded begging for help. By nightfall, 3,000 Americans were dead at Omaha alone, the bloodiest of the 5 beaches. Meanwhile, the battle needed supplies. Since the Allies did not yet hold a major port, they built 2 giant artificial harbors called mulberries. Every day, 150-200 ships brought in 7,000 vehicles, 15,000 tons of supplies, and thousands of men through Arromanches, British sector, and Omaha, American sector. But then, disaster struck. In mid-June, Normandy was hit by its worst storm in 40 years. Ships were tossed like toys, and the giant caissons of the floating ports broke apart. Piers and bridges were ripped away and scattered. For 4 days, supplies stopped. On June the 23rd, when skies finally cleared, wrecks of ships lay smashed across the beaches. The British engineers worked quickly to repair Arromanches, but the American harbor at Omaha was destroyed beyond use. De Gaulle, leader of the Free French, had been in exile for 4 years. Now, stepping onto French soil at Courcelles, he carried himself with pride, but also distance. Churchill had written privately, "I must inflict on you a visit from General de Gaulle. It is enough for him to come to headquarters. No need to greet him on the beach." Churchill still did not trust him. De Gaulle spent only 1 day in France, but he made it count. He met Field Marshal Montgomery, gave speeches, and let the crowd see him as the face of France. Cameraman Norman Johnson noted, he was tall, serious, and ignored the camera. A star in the making. In Bayeux, crowds cheered at last to see Frenchmen free again. De Gaulle used the moment to show his independence. At the town hall, he installed his own officials, without asking the Allies. He made it clear, France would decide its own future. The price was high. At a funeral for the 81st Airborne, Comrades gave them a final salute. Ready, aim, fire, aim, fire, aim, fire. On June the 9th, the Americans finally captured Iceni, a small town that had been heavily bombed to drive out its German defenders. This was key. Until then, the Germans had blocked the link between U.S. troops at Omaha and those at Utah. With Iceni taken, the Allied line was connected at last, stretching 60 miles from Ostreham to the Cotentin Peninsula. Beyond the ruined streets, townspeople looked to the sea. At last, a French ship was sailing back across the channel. With the Allies firmly ashore, it was time to bring in General Charles de Gaulle. The Germans quickly took advantage of the Allied pause. Although some reinforcements were delayed, 2 armored divisions, including the feared 12th SS Panzer, Hitler Youth Division, counterattacked on June the 7th, 8th, and 9th. They blocked the road to Cannes and built strong defenses around the city. Allied bombing raids on Cannes did little to help, but they gave German propaganda a chance to show that French civilians were suffering just as much as their soldiers. While the Germans still controlled Cannes, the first French refugees began leaving their homes, caught between 2 armies. Allied paratroopers, scattered far and wide by poor drops, were left isolated. Many couldn't link up with the troops coming inland from the beaches. Some were captured. The U.S. airborne forces lost half their equipment in 1 in 5 men, but their wide dispersion confused the Germans, making them think far more soldiers had been dropped than was true. And yet, by late afternoon, more waves of troops were landing. Slowly, painfully, the Americans clawed their way forward. At last, Omaha was secured. The landings had succeeded, but the war for Normandy was only beginning. 2 days later, General Montgomery arrived. He wanted overwhelming force before moving forward, so he delayed his armored divisions. Cannes, which was supposed to fall on D-Day itself, remained in German hands. British troops, relieved that they had landed without heavy losses, seemed to relax too soon. Their cameramen reflected this, casually filming happy French villagers posing for the cause. On June the 8th, Norman Clogg, one of the film crew, recorded moments of peace as German prisoners were treated and wounded soldiers were cared for. 5 days later, Clogg himself was killed in action. The Allies were already 10 days behind schedule. U.S. forces needed to capture the deep-water port of Cherbourg quickly. Although the city was surrounded, the Germans fought on until June the 26th, when American troops entered the suburbs. That same day, German Commander General von Schlieben surrendered to General Collins. He wiped his boots politely before meeting his victor, but he broke his oath to Hitler, who demanded his officers fight to the death. In fact, Schlieben gave up even before all his men laid down their arms. The Americans, who had already lost 22,000 men since D-Day, were often rough with their prisoners. Many captured Germans were either very young or very old, showing how weak the German army in the West had become. Most of its best soldiers were busy fighting the Soviets in the East. By the end, 36,000 prisoners were taken at Cherbourg. With the port in American hands, one of the last strongholds of the Atlantic Wall had fallen. But Hitler reacted by taking personal control of the Western Front. He fired Field Marshal von Rundstedt, who had suggested negotiating, and replaced him with Field Marshal von Kluge, who was more obedient. Field Marshal Rommel, meanwhile, could only try to delay what he knew would be defeat. Eisenhower, too, was worried. The Americans had taken Cherbourg, but the British still had not captured Caen, which was supposed to be the launch pad for a push inland. The Germans were dug in across open country with space for reinforcements, while the Allies were stuck along the narrow coastline. In the Cotentin countryside, U.S. troops struggled against the bocage, thick hedgerows that formed natural fortresses. German defenders could fire from cover, stop entire battalions with a few men, and slip around the edges of fields. American tanks were forced to stick to roads, easy targets for enemy fire. Soldiers cursed Normandy as, "this goddamn country." But first came Paris. On August the 19th, smoke hung over the city. News of the Allies' approach sparked an uprising. Parisians built barricades and fought the retreating Germans. The German command decided to abandon the city rather than destroy it. Convoys of soldiers streamed east, leaving behind chaos and flames. The next day, General de Gaulle visited Eisenhower. Ike wanted to surround Paris and avoid a bloody battle inside the capital, but he argued that the Allies must march in, not only to prevent more bloodshed, but to ensure France was liberated by French hands, not left to communist resistance groups. Eisenhower agreed. Bradley ordered 2nd French Armored Division, Heroes of Falaise, to enter Paris first. After battles south of the city, they broke through, and on August the 25th, the tricolor flew again. Crowds filled the streets, cheering, waving flags, and showering soldiers with flowers. Women wore red, men white shirts. Montgomery, and the sky was blue, to deliver the colors results of France reborn, finally committed heavy force against Caen. On July the 7th, British bombers dropped 2,500 tons of bombs on the city. After 2 days of fierce fighting, 115,000 British troops entered the eastern part of Caen, but the city was 3/4 destroyed. Thousands of civilians had been killed, and large parts were still under German control. By July the 13th, Montgomery finally visited Caen, more than a month after D-Day. It had been planned to fall on the first day of the invasion. The British presented it as a victory, but in truth the battle for Caen dragged on, and Churchill himself came to see the situation with his own eyes. Even then, the Germans still held strong positions nearby. Eisenhower was disappointed and increasingly placed his trust in General Omar Bradley, calm, efficient, and already proven at Omaha, Utah, and Cherbourg. Bradley now prepared Operation Cobra, a massive breakout. On July the 25th, thousands of Allied bombers blasted German positions near St. Lo, wiping out the elite division. American tanks, now fitted with metal blades to cut through hedgerows, pushed forward at last. The Germans cracked, surrendering in huge numbers, even if most were not elite troops. By the end of July, American forces had reached Coutances, Avranches, and Granville, the last Norman ports before Brittany. The long-awaited breakthrough had finally come. In early August, the 2nd French Armored Division landed at Utah Beach. These men had been fighting in Africa for years, waiting for this chance to return home as liberators. Their commander, General Leclerc, tall and thin, had chosen to follow de Gaulle in 1940 instead of Vichy. Now he returned to France at the head of his division, ready to fight alongside the Americans. At Bradley's headquarters, Allied cameramen filmed Montgomery, ever conscious of the camera, a moment of Allied unity before the next big push. This was something he did well. Under Eisenhower's pressure, Field Marshal Montgomery finally agreed to let the Americans lead the last phase of the battle. General Bradley was ready, and he had one more powerful card, General George Patton. Patton, famous for his bold style and his Colt .45 pistol, was eager for action. "When trouble starts, they expect me to fix it," he once said, and this time, he would. At dawn, the Germans launched a final counterattack near Mortain, ordered directly by Hitler. Their goal, to drive the Allies back to the sea. But Allied fighter bombers, the fast Typhoons, destroyed the attack before it could succeed. Von Kluge, the German commander, admitted it had no chance and soon after took his own life. Mortain was the last German offensive in the West. For de Gaulle, the man who had called on France to resist back in June 1940, it was a moment of triumph. France, once defeated and humiliated, now stood proudly with the victors. The victory parade down the Champs-Élysées sealed the legend. The next day, at Place de la Concorde, Eisenhower and Bradley stood beside de Gaulle to show their support for his leadership. The Americans knew that in the post-war world, when Europe would be divided, they would need France as an ally. The story of Normandy is often remembered in color, but the original films are in black and white. Whatever the format, each frame preserves the faces of the men who fought there. Many were anonymous, lost in the vast sea of soldiers. Who were you? Just another face in the crowd, or the one turning toward the camera? Whoever you were, your sacrifice is remembered. Thank you.